Hi, it's Haley. Welcome back for another episode of Therapy Talks. We're joined by Dr. Jake Santos, and we discuss the impact that social media has on adolescents, their self worth, and their self identity. Well, it's lovely to meet you. I'm Haley. Thanks for having us. I'm really looking forward to getting to know you a bit today and maybe having a really helpful discussion.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm,
That sounds
I'm
good.
excited to be a part of it.
Yeah. So the topic that we kind of were thinking about is how social media has changed maybe adolescents and young people in the way that they view their
Mhm.
self-worth, if that
Okay.
sounds okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. So maybe you could just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your professional background and a little bit about you.
I go by Jacob. The only person who calls me Dr. Jacob Santos is my mom. But I prefer more of the informality, and so that's what I go with. I have a master's in clinical mental health counseling. And after I got my master's, I was like, oh, I love counseling, but I also love teaching. And so I want to become an educator. So I went and pursued a doctorate in counselor education and supervision. And then COVID happened. And basically, I was going to move into a faculty position at a school. And then COVID was a disaster, I mean, for all humans, but especially for academia. And the school that I was going to join was kind of like, you have to wait till after COVID. And I was kind of like, that's all right, I'll leave. So basically, I moved from there into starting my own private practice. And I've been doing that for a few years. I also make content on TikTok. And today I actually posted the first thing of my content that I've ever posted on Instagram, which was just kind of a fun and different thing. And yeah, I think my primary audience who I work with tends to be either adolescents or young adults somewhere in their 20s and 30s, which I realize that's a wide range to call a young adult, but
Mhm.
that's where we are.
Yeah, that's so wonderful. It sounds like you have really a passion for learning, mental health, psychology, and you took that passion and directed it towards your own studies and therefore helping others with their own well-being.
Mhm.
So what
That's a
have
really
you,
good way of putting
yeah.
it.
So what have you noticed as some trends and themes within young adults and adolescents in terms of their social media usage?
Mm. It it's a fascinating topic because it's a new topic. Like 20 years ago, when I was a kid, social media was not a thing, and I spent my days like outside climbing trees, building forts, doing all the things that used to happen when we didn't have smartphones or social media. And now, like more and more research is coming out that basically is pointing to the amount of time that kids spend on social media is just ballooning. Like it
Mm,
went over the course of a very few years, it went from like 20% of their time to 40% to like 70%. And we don't really know what that does to people yet. But also, it's really interesting to watch how adults respond, or parents or teachers or like anybody really responds to adolescents who are experiencing that. Because what I've found is that there is a very polarizing response, as in some parent teachers are like, whatever, it's fine. If it makes it so that they're not bothering me, not a problem. But others are kind of very judgmental and like, oh no, this is a terrible thing. I want to keep you from it. I want to protect you from it. And at the end of the day, like I work with a decent number of like teenagers right now, and all of them use social media in some form or another, and they all have a very different relationship with it.
mhm.
And I think that is one of the funny things about it that makes it kind of like we know that this has some impact, but we don't exactly know what it is.
Okay. So you're saying we're not really sure of the long-term effects because it is relatively new. Like for our generation and whatnot, there wasn't really the usage. It was just starting to come out and we were starting to investigate how to use it. And then with individuals who are like parents or teachers who are a little bit older, who didn't necessarily grow up with it in the same way, they had that polarizing response of either love or hate it. So for
Mhm.
you and your perspective, and especially from the mental health perspective, what are your thoughts?
Mm. I think that the impact that social media has on an adolescent, and this is going to very much summarize my whole opinion,
Yeah.
but I think it is more dependent on the impact the other people in their life have on them, like how it will go. A great example, and this is a really sad example. I hope I can actually say this
Mhm.
in here, but like yesterday I was out with my I'm married, I have kids. We were hanging out at the beach, and there was another family nearby. And there was what appeared to be like a 5-year-old girl. And she went up to ask her mother something. And her mother's response to her was, "Can't you see that you're annoying me? Please go away." And like, I'm sitting there and like, that breaks my heart.
Mm-hmm.
But also, when you're told that by the adults, by the caregivers, by anyone in your life in reality, I would imagine that that person is then going to go into adolescence and move on to social media with this attitude of like, I'm just kind of an annoying person. Like I have to fade into the background. This isn't good for me to like stand out or be me really. And so I think for that person, social media has the potential to have a very negative impact because the algorithm is smart, whether it's Instagram, TikTok, like YouTube. All of these algorithms are smarter than we are because they're designed by large groups of very smart people who sit in a room and figure out how to give people whatever will keep their attention. And that goes well when you're like, I know where I'm at today. I know what I'm looking for. If I'm in a low mood, I'm going to look for something to draw me out of it. And if I'm like in a good mood, we'll see what happens. But I think especially like with TikTok, with some of the algorithms that are more designed around feeding you what you're interested in, when you're in a low mood and you see something that you relate to that kind of brings you lower, the algorithm will be like, oh, this kept you here. And so it will continue to feed you more and more things that bring you lower and lower. And I think that is something that I've seen that's kind of scary because I will have people who come and meet with me and they'll be like, I went down the rabbit hole and now I'm questioning all of these things about myself, about my behavior, and it doesn't feel good. And I haven't
Mm-hmm.
slept and I haven't eaten and not
Mm-hmm.
ideal.
So you kind of highlight this idea of like responsible use and like lack of responsibility that we can have because of the algorithms. For example, with like that parent child, the mom or the parent, whoever it was unable to like pay attention to their child because of that distraction, right?
Mhm.
And so that highlights the need for responsible use. It's like what are the priorities in those moments that we're in, especially around others, versus like the algorithm, like that's something that we don't have control over. Like if we just happen to look at something for too long, then it knows we like it and then it keeps showing us more of that. So we can't really change that algorithm, but then it can lead us into a more unhelpful state.
Mhm. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that it's neither bad nor good? It's about the awareness of it and awareness of our use?
I would, yeah, I would say that. I think that the the potential for it to be either is very much present.
Mm-hmm.
But the more aware you are of how you're interacting with it, of what you're pursuing, of even what you're like spending time watching. Like if you intentionally are like, okay, I know I'm in a bad mood. So when I see something that I know classically I might even stay on,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to swipe past it quickly.
Right.
I think being able to recognize and do that is really valuable.
Mm-hmm. And also maybe have the motivation to do as such, because like you said, it's so entertaining. It sucks us in. We're just like, oh, this
Mhm.
is great content that I'm looking at.
Mhm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It it's funny because like the role of a content creator is to create content that's relatable. Because when I create something that's relatable, you want to spend time with it. You want to engage. With a lot of things, that's just entertaining. It's fun. It's good. Like it gives you a laugh, a smile, positive.
Mm-hmm.
But with certain things that can be very destructive, I think a great example is that there's been a massive increase in the number of like adolescents who are getting medically assessed for having tics, and not tics like the little bugs, but tics like the physical like body movement. And over the last like 2 or 3 years, it went from being like 2 to 3% of like adolescents reporting that to 10 to 20%, which is like this major, major jump. Like doctors were kind of like, something's not right.
Mm-hmm.
So over the last 2 years, there's been a number of like papers published on this. But basically, one of the things they found is that when you consume content that you're like, oh, I think I might relate to that, that could be me. If there's behavior or something talked about in that content, you can actually like adopt that and begin doing it as your own. So basically, one of the things they found is that there were all of these adolescents who were watching content on like ADHD and Tourette's and being like, oh, I think that might be me. And then they started seeing more and more and more of the actual symptoms of the behavior showing up in their lives in a way that was like, this wasn't here before, and now it is.
Mm-hmm. So is it almost like a placebo effect, like believing that since it's so relatable, then that person would take on some of those behaviors?
I think it's partially that. It's partially that idea of like, if this is me, I should look this way. I think there is also a major desire to define ourselves. And I think that especially is present. I think it's present through all ages, but I think it's especially present in adolescence because they're like, I want to figure out who I am. I want to figure out where I fit in. I want to figure out like, what is my future going to be like? And right now there's a trend of like being different in some way, whether it's like neurodivergency or just, you have your thing that makes you special.
Mm-hmm.
And on the one hand, social media is great because you have all these people who are seeing things that are like, oh, I don't have access to the mental health support that I would need in order to get diagnosed or to like know that this is a thing for me. But I'm able to see content for free and be like, oh, I relate to that. That makes a lot of sense. I do think this is me.
Mm-hmm.
I
Okay.
think the major downside of that, though, like, so the DSM, which is the
Mm-hmm.
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, I think that's the whole name, but like almost every diagnosis in there has a clause that says, unless the symptoms are better explained by something else. And that's the scary part of this, because there are so many things like ADHD, autism, trauma, like you look at the diagnoses for all of those and there's overlap.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have people showing up and being like, oh, I related to this one of those things, they're like, well, this must be me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, it might be, it could be. And your insight and opinion and like ability to recognize that is valuable, because
Mm-hmm.
especially as a therapist, like I don't sit with anyone 24 hours a day. I sit with people like maybe an hour a week. And so I'm always looking to be like, what do you observe in your life when I'm not around? Because that's when you're going to get the most realistic picture of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But I think
Right.
that the flip side and danger there is that when you start looking for something, it's research bias, you see it. And the more you look for it, the more you see it. And it creates this very funny, like, I know that I see it and I know it's there, but I don't know if I'm just seeing it because I'm looking for it. I don't know if I'm just doing this, behaving this way, like thinking this way because something led me to it, or if this is actually me.
Mm-hmm. So is that leading to like an overdiagnosis of individuals because they feel as though they're relating to these symptoms or experiences?
Do you think it is?
Well, sometimes they're like, I have this one thing. And I'm like, well, in my profession, I don't have the ability to diagnose someone. So I go, okay, like, why don't we keep a log of these symptoms? And let's also
Mhm.
see if we can also list out what the DSM would say are the symptoms and see how many times this happens for you.
Mhm. I think that approach where you actually like pay attention, notice, log, like, and then move forward, I think that makes perfect sense. And I think that is one of the best ways to go here.
Mm-hmm.
And I realize I sound like I'm probably sidestepping the question of like, is it overdiagnosed? And I think that's largely because I don't think there is a good answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of these things like autism or ADHD are great examples. Both of those things in people like born with a uterus and in women, they are underdiagnosed because they're under researched because of the like patriarchal nature of psychology and medicine in general. And so I think there is a part of this that's like, no, this is great because you're giving we're learning all of these things right now because we have all these people who are coming forward and just being like, this is my experience. And so that gives us a way of being like, okay, these are things to look for. This is awesome. I think the flip side though is that with all of these things, there's also a major variance. And so there's no like, this is what it looks like for everyone. I think a really simple example with ADHD is like some people with ADHD are like, if I drink coffee, if I have caffeine, puts me to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And other people are like, no, it just works like it does for everybody else. And so it creates this question where people are like, I thought I had this, but then I learned this, which now is making me question it. And it's like, well, yeah, it could, because you could be different because you are biologically, chemically different than everyone else. Maybe not
Right.
hugely, but at least a little bit.
Mm-hmm. So you make some good points. It's like a lot of our statistics of the prevalence of certain mental health diagnoses is coming from a time probably before the way that we use social media. For example, like to
Mhm.
get like a good scientific empirical article, it takes some time. So it's not really from maybe the last few years where things have been extremely prevalent on social media. And I also noticed like the trend of more mental health
Mhm.
related TikToks or reels or posts or things that really describe these experiences, which is great because in some ways it decreases the stigma, but maybe it increases the over alignment of individuals with these symptomologies. So we never want to minimize someone's experience, right? We want to
Mhm.
like validate and encourage them to have and to hold space for whatever they're experiencing, but we don't necessarily want to overdiagnose either. Like there it would be reasonable for everyone in this world to struggle in one way or the other. But are those collection of challenges and struggles truly the full blown diagnosis?
Mhm. And that's a question that's so case by case that
Mm-hmm.
there's no exact answer for everybody.
Yeah. And like earlier, you made the really great point is that in adolescence and in young years, when we're now first really getting into like when social media is becoming prevalent, like we're not using it when we're toddlers, ideally, right? So then we're going, okay, how do I self identify? Right. And so we're trying to make a place in the world. And if we feel connected to certain information, we're more likely to align with it and be like, this is the thing that makes me unique. And I'm going to be proud of that.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is also where like social media can be incredibly like damaging,
Mm-hmm.
because when you're looking for, or if you're looking for what makes you unique, social media is basically this giant peer pressure machine.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not just about mental health, that is about everything. Like, what are you wearing? Who are you talking to? Are you good at dancing? Are you not? Can you sing? What other skills do you have? What kind of house do you live in? Like, everything.
Mm-hmm.
And it's it's very easy for us to base our worth on everything that is like, it feels like it's tangible control, but it's really not.
Mm-hmm.
As in, I'm like, I feel like if I have this thing, or if I have that friend, or if I am a certain way, or I achieve a certain grade, like whatever it is, if I have that, then I'm a worthwhile person. But in reality, like, this is one of the things I commonly say to everybody I work with. But if you feel like you have to prove your worth to yourself, you will never succeed.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't believe that you already have it, nothing that you're going to do is going to convince yourself that you do.
Right. Isn't
And
that also a conundrum within ourselves? Because if we are lacking self confidence or self identity, we would try and build that ideally.
it is. And I think that's like, life is a paradox in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And arriving at a place of self acceptance, which is what I personally argue is like the thing to work towards, arriving there is actually the thing that enables you to get where you want to go.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the easiest illustrations of that is, it's like, if you want to get into peak physical condition, you can either force yourself to the gym, force yourself to eat healthy, like almost discipline yourself into it. But at some point that turns into almost a punishment, because it's like, I have to do this in order to become this person. I have to do this. Or you can be like, you know what, this is who I am, and I like and I care about this person, and because of that, like, I'm okay how I am now, but I also want to treat myself really well.
Mm-hmm.
And that will invariably influence what I eat, what I do with my time, what I do with my body. And it will move you in a direction that invariably will make you healthier, which will actually enable you to physically do more and become this person that you want to become.
Mm-hmm. So there's an encouragement in, like, obviously the healthy behaviors and actions to create the person or the identity that you want to have, right? And then you will have that ability to feel confident, feel how you want to feel by doing those great things.
Ideally.
Yeah, ideally. It is, like you said, it's a huge paradox, right? Because sometimes, I know it sounds bad, but sometimes to clients, I'm like, you have to try to believe in these wonderful qualities in yourself, because then it does inherently then create a more positive self-image, right? So
Mhm.
even just like the whole mirror challenge of saying one nice thing about either your physical form or your personality or who you are to yourself in the mirror every day, right? And picking out one thing at a
Mhm.
time to really draw awareness to those things and feeling more concrete about those things, right? So if you were like, what would be some tips and strategies that you would recommend to people who are struggling in their self-image and self-identity within like themselves and like and within social media?
So this is going to feel like a very roundabout answer to that.
Okay.
The concept of portraiture, as in like painting a portrait of someone, is that you look at them and you draw out the fine parts that you want to honor.
Mm-hmm.
The concept of like much of the media we see, news, magazines, all of these things, is kind of the opposite of like, we're trying to draw out the drama. We're trying to draw out the negative things and highlight those. And then social media is kind of its own category, where it's not as much about honoring the good things as it is about just bragging about them.
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone, not all the time, but like that's there for sure. And I think the one of the baseline things to begin working towards is focusing on trying to honor, like, what are your strengths as a person? What are the things that make you uniquely and beautifully you? Like those little things that maybe you've been self-conscious about before. Are those actually something to be self-conscious about, or are they something that actually is, you wouldn't be you without it? And so I think part of it is just a mindset shift to work towards thinking that way. And then part of it is that, going back to portraiture, portraits are typically not painted by yourself. Yes, self-portraits are a thing. I know that. But like most of the best art is actually created by someone else of you.
Mm.
And I think that's where like almost every hierarchy of need has some sort of like social connection as part of our needs as human or as humans. And I think that learning to actually pursue connection in a way that's not just like trivial, but in a way that's like, hey, I care about the people I'm around as people, and therefore I want to build them up. So I want to highlight things that are positive about them. I want to encourage them. And in a sense, like doing that and looking for the reciprocal of it, of having someone do that for you, like
Mm-hmm.
that makes an enormous difference, because
Mm-hmm.
it's so easy to have not just the voices of those around you, but also your own internal voice be like, wow, you suck. And I think part of that is just we don't look for situations where it's like, hey, Haley, I just want to point out, like, you're really good at giving insightful feedback. Like, you
Mm.
hear what I say and you give it back to me in so many less words, and it sounds really good. Like, way to go. You're good at that.
I'm listening. I'm like trying to like, yeah, well, I appreciate that. Thank you. And I think you make a really good point, is that we have to sometimes look for the exception to the rule. So for example, if we often think poorly of ourselves, when are the times when we don't think poorly of ourselves? Or how do other people see us, right? And maybe we can highlight those strengths and focus on that instead.
Mhm. I
Because I don't
think
know about you, but with many clients who have a negative self-image, they're like, well, I'm always bad at this, or I'm always not good in this or that way, right? And it's like, well, let's eliminate some of the absolute rules, because that would be like, you should buy a lottery ticket if you always know these things. But so like
Mhm.
trying to help them to reframe that in a lot of ways.
I think I think that trying to, I'm not going to hate on CBT too much,
Yeah.
but I'm a little bit,
Yeah, that's okay,
Um,
please.
where I think CBT tends to fall flat
Mm-hmm.
is best exhibited by therapists, actually. because therapists know all this stuff. Like, we are trained in this. We have spent like days, weeks, years learning all of these things about how to function. And then we have very dysfunctional lives ourselves at times, where it's like, I know the right things to do. I know how to not do this to myself, but like, here we go. I'm going to do it anyways. And I think that a big part of that is that as much as we can know the right thing, doing the right thing is very different.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways to shift that, more than just kind of through sheer force of will in ourselves, is to kind of take yourself out of that perspective and look for a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that is actually like, it's a gift that we can all give to other people to actually intentionally highlight, point out like, hey, I want to tell you this thing that's really cool about you. I want to give you a different perspective on yourself, on your life, on your strengths, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we actually get into something tangible that a person could actually do.
Mm-hmm.
You can sort of do that for yourself by doing an exercise. I'm a narrative therapist, so this is very much a narrative.
That's what I was going to say. I'm like, you're leaning into your wonderful strength of narrative therapy.
I wrote a dissertation on this. I could talk about it forever, but I won't. But you can actually like do an exercise where you're like, I'm not going to be me right now. I'm going to be somebody very close to me. Maybe it's a best friend, maybe it's a family member, somebody like that. And I'm going to describe me through their eyes, not through my own. And I'm only going to focus on the positive side. It can be a very uncomfortable exercise. And at first it's usually like I don't know, what would they say type thing.
Mm-hmm.
But if you actually like challenge yourself to do that and are patient and gracious with yourself, show yourself some compassion, it's amazing how doing that can change your perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Because like, it's funny because it's like in a cognitive behavioral therapy standpoint, it would be like a reframe or a cognitive challenge, right? But then in narrative therapy, I don't know why, but like when I think narrative therapy is something I use very minimally. I don't have a lot of training in it, but the way I see it is like almost like this softer approach. And it's like telling yourself a story, but very using like true facts in a way that you truly can resonate and align with. That's my kind of way of thinking about it in my mind.
It's a really unique approach because it's inherently artistic.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's where the idea of portraiture even comes in, because narrative theory isn't this like, here are steps that you go through. Narrative theory is much more, here's this ideology of how you think about conversation, about people, about growth, and that's how you work. That's what you do. It's kind of like, do you know the term social constructionism?
Mm-hmm. But
Like
please define it for everyone else.
I will. I know it's one of those $1 million terms.
Yeah.
This actually, so there's social constructionism and social constructivism. And I, for the life of me, cannot get them straight because they are slightly different. One is in research and one is just in normal life. But basically, it is this idea that the way we learn, the way we grow is through interaction with others. I always talk about it like tossing a ball back and forth, where it's like, you have a ball, you toss it to me by saying something, some fact, I catch it, I hear that fact, and then I make an observation about it and throw it back. And through that interaction in the space between us, we learn, we both gain insights that we didn't have before, we grow. And in a sense, we become different than we were before.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of narrative theory is based on that idea, where it's like, narrative theory doesn't even look at counseling as a bunch of like individual moments. It looks at it as this one long continuous conversation that starts at the beginning and ends at the end of therapy. And arguably like never ends, but like that's
ideally.
We don't need to get into that.
Yeah.
But like it's not that it never ends because you never end therapy. It's that you're always growing and changing throughout life. But it's a very unique way of thinking about things, because the goal is never to make someone not the person that they were. Instead, it's always to find, highlight, and empower and like draw out all of these things that will enable them to get where they want to go, which is really exciting and fun and positive. And it makes for a really interesting way to handle things like trauma, where it's like we don't deny any of the pain. Like we bring that in. We bring in trauma. We keep it in the room, but we change the way that you interact with it. And that has such a powerful way of like so the narrative word is storying or restorying. And it's a verb that basically means you take your experience and your understanding of your experience and you effectively rewrite it in a way that serves you better without changing the facts. You're just changing the way you interact with them.
So I'll try and delightfully summarize again for everyone. We're taking facts, which are true things, but we interact with them in a way that is more helpful instead of unhelpful. For example, like we focus on our strengths instead of our limitations, or if we have a limitation, how does that create more of a unique individual experience for us? Because all things about every one of us has some sort of value that it offers to ourselves or the world.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm picking up what you're putting down.
It's funny because I'm always like, yes, and. But also at some point it's like, well, you don't need yes and. Yes is good. I think that's good.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what I tell to, like, when I do pull up some narrative kind of themes, it's like, what do we know about ourselves? What do we know about the world? What do we know about our interactions that we have with other people or institutions or experiences? And how do we want to express that in a way that we feel what we need to be feeling? You know? So it's kind of like that, like you said, like that ability to curate the experience that we're having. And so in many ways, as more and more I have these podcasts and talk to different working professionals about different forms of counseling modalities, they all share these commonalities, right? Of this intention to learn and to grow, or to, like, if we were to compare it to EMDR and narrative therapy, it's like the interactions with others. Well, what are we learning from those experiences or associating that we can move forward with? Or cognitive behavioral therapy, what are we reframing, which is similar to some of the acts of like narrative therapy? Or there's all of these crossovers, but it's the picking the therapy that we feel is best for the client, or the client feels like it's best for them. And just like in its own right, its own form of individuality of well-being.
Part of what's funny about all theory is that none of it exists in its own like vacuum. There's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of crossover, and theorists in general love to fight, because it's like, well, you can't tell me how I'm doing things differently than I say I'm doing them. And it creates this very unique tension where it's like, no, you have no idea what you're talking about. But it's like, well, you do. You're just using different language for it. And at the heart of it all, like, I pretty firmly believe that like people become therapists because they care about other people and want to support them. And like it's funny because that's the heart of therapy. And yet there's all this tension around like the details of how it's done. And it's in a way it's unnecessary, I would argue. Like, I know that it propels research forward, it gets people to move forward and figure things out, but also it's a distraction from the like, what is the point? Which, to kind of bring this back to the whole conversation of social media ideally exists for the purpose of bringing people together, of putting you in interaction, like in situations where you have interactions with people where it's like you are building each other up, you're encouraging, supporting, like you're giving people a chance to not feel alone. But it can very quickly turn from that into bullying or abusing or like just flushing away time, for lack of a better description. Like if it is not used responsibly, it can quickly become something that doesn't actually serve the purpose that I think it's there for. And the way that I think that parents have one of the most important roles in life in general, because the way that a parent talks to, interacts with their kid will in large part define how the kid grows into an adult who thinks about themselves and interacts with the world. And when a parent through intentional or unintentional action, like basically raises a kid who's like, I always need to be proving my worth. I'm never good enough. I like, there's tension that I can't resolve.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy for social media to become this thing that just, it affirms that. It makes it even louder of a voice in their head,
Mm-hmm.
versus a parent who's like, no, like, you don't have anything to prove to anyone. You're you, and that is good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Like, somebody like that grows into somebody who's like, social media is fun, but I don't feel like I have to do anything because of it. And it doesn't make me feel like an awful person most of the time. I think for everybody, sometimes social media
Mm-hmm.
does that thing where it's like, just going to go cry in a corner for a while. But like, it doesn't have to do that.
Right. So you're just really talking about the importance of like helpful parenting and like that support
Mhm.
or that open, positive regard from parents towards their children.
Mhm.
How can parents be aware of that? I think it's such a challenging space to be in, like to choose to bring a person into the world and then raise them, but then in those moments, not really understand like some of the impacts of these, like something like such as social media may have.
Mhm. It's tricky is I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, so they're very
Mhm.
young. And being a parent is both incredibly exciting and fun at times, and like maddeningly frustrating. Like, I want to drive my head through a wall.
Mhm.
And as an adult who is the parent of children, which most parents are adults, um, I'm older, I'm more responsible, I'm more mature, and I have a lot of the skills that I need to regulate myself when I'm like, what I would like to do is just scream, but that is not helpful. So I'm going to do my best not to do that. But there are times where it's like, it's so hard to hold that in. And I think that's where learning to be compassionate, not just towards your kids, but towards yourself, is huge. Because if you can be compassionate, if you can recognize that I don't need to be the perfect parent, I don't need to do everything right all the time. I do need to own things when I do them wrong. And I do need to give my child the same compassion that I give myself. Like, that won't get you all the way, but that'll get you really far.
Mhm.
And I think that gets missed a lot. Yeah.
Mhm. Like again, like it's like you were saying, just the ability to emotionally regulate despite such frustrating situations and experiences, right? And then, but
Mhm.
also past that moment of emotional regulation, be compassionate to ourselves and the situation and the children.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. So, how would you maybe support parents from that perspective, like to learn that? Because I think it's a really challenging thing. And I often tease with clients, I'm like, okay, I'm going to teach you a skill, but unfortunately, you're going to have to practice it lots of times. So, this isn't a one and done situation.
There is, uh, I forget the name of the book, but I believe it's by Peter Levine.
Mhm.
And it's one of the classic like trauma books.
Walking
And
the tiger or something like that.
it's, there's two. That's one of
Okay.
them. This is the
Okay.
other one.
Okay.
The book is yellow.
Okay.
But in it, he talks about how the way that we respond when we see someone get hurt initially is about us. It's not about them.
Mhm.
And he tells the story of like, he's at an event and there's someone on crutches who trips and falls. And immediately everybody around them like rushes into the scene to try and pick them up. Because it's like, oh, this is very uncomfortable to see you on crutches fall when I'm like a fully able person who can run over and help pick you up.
Mhm.
But from a like experiential resolution perspective, when you fall and you immediately get picked up, that disempowers you,
Mhm.
because it's not something that you were like, I fell and was able through my own means and strength to get back up or ask for help. Instead, it's I fell and was immediately picked up. And we do that as parents a lot, where it's like your kid falls and your reaction is like, oh no, am I a bad parent? They're gonna like have a cut on their leg. And
Mhm.
you run over and try and pick them up. And what he argues for is that anytime something happens that you have a reaction to, your first response should be to yourself, should be to like gauge, measure, okay, what am I feeling? I'm feeling this panic. It's going to be okay. And then once you've kind of regulated that, then you go over and you sit with them and you're like, what happened? Like, when would you like to get up? When would you like this to move forward?
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you're able to do that, when you're able to take your own like urgency out of the equation,
Mm-hmm.
it changes how you're able to interact with it.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I just almost want to pause and sink that in because I actually haven't heard that before. And I think it's so applicable because we have the desire to care for ourselves. Like, how are we feeling in terms of the situation? Like when you said the kid falls and the parent goes like, "Oh, I'm such a bad parent. My kid scraped their knee." But it's like we can't adequately show up for that child until we take a moment to check in with ourselves, notice what we're feeling, honor our feelings, but then truly still prioritize also the well-being of the child or the other person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a huge one, right? And I think, again, that's like the need for emotional regulation and the ability to be connected to oneself, mindful of one's own personal emotional experience, body experiences, bias in those moments.
Mm-hmm. It's
So I almost want to
can I
apply that like metaphor to social media in some ways. It's like when there's content creation, and I find that often influencers or content creators will be like, I don't know if I should share this or not. And like there's this whole dialogue of should or should not share certain information or experiences for fear of being judged, but then they're still honoring their own experience to share that and fully acknowledging that that's their employment in many ways to have those types of experiences to share. So it's almost like they're still honoring themselves, but still being truthful to like the experience that others may take in from that post or story highlight or whatever it may be.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's so tricky because you want to honor the agency of everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Like whatever I post, I want to not make the decision for you of whether or not you
Mm-hmm.
should consume it. I want you to decide that.
Mm-hmm.
And invariably, some people, they got that. They're like, oh, this is a therapist who's posting something on trauma. I can't do this right now. Swipe.
Mm-hmm.
And other people are like, oh no, I'm in a terrible spot, but like I have to. It there's Leo Kottke is a guitarist, which this is he's old, but he would occasionally do tracks where he would kind of do like almost like a kind of spoken word, but more just like talk while playing his guitar in very humorous and comedic ways. And in one of those songs that he was doing, he talked about it as like it's like looking at a book of jungle diseases, where the more you look at it, the sicker you feel. But you just can't stop because you never know what's going to be on the next page. That's going to be like, oh no, look at that. It's even
Mm-hmm.
worse. And
Hmm.
it's hard to put that down and be like, no, like I'm in a space right now where I need to not this. I need to do something else. And I
Totally.
as a creator, I always want to trust that people will be in a position to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I also know that not everyone will.
Right.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's like, I'm not a huge creator at all, which partially I'm like, I wish I was different because I think we all do. Like, we all have that pressure when you're trying. But also, part of me is like, it's kind of nice because then I feel slightly less responsibility, even
Mm-hmm.
though I know that any creator, whether nobody knows their name or millions of people do, like if you're putting something out there, you have responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
But it's complicated.
Yeah, definitely. Like there's, like you're saying, by just what we're sharing or what we're discussing today, it has an impact. And we can only hope that individuals have the awareness to go, what's helpful for me or what's unhelpful for me, be able to have that discerning eye. It's
Mhm.
like going through the grocery store and actually reading the nutritional contents of something before deciding to eat it.
It's I've yeah, I've started doing that more and more recently because like I in my own personal growth as a person or story or however I want to phrase it, the last 2 or 3 years have been the first in my life where I'm like, I think I do actually accept myself as a person, and that's changing how I live.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is just I'm getting to the age where I'm starting to see like, oh, if I eat an ice cream sundae for breakfast, I feel sick. Like, so I'm seeing cause and effect play out more quickly. But also as I care more, I'm like, okay, I actually want to know these things. And it makes life a lot harder when you're actually like paying attention and being like, oh, wow, this has a lot of things in it that I don't want to put in my body. But also this
Mm-hmm.
is the easiest option. And I think that like challenge there plays out in so many ways in our lives where it's like, it's always easier to sit down and do nothing than to get up and do something.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Very
And
often as much, right? And it can be sometimes really frustrating depending on different relationships that a person may be in. So,
mhm.
in your mind, what do you think would be like the long-term progression of social media use?
Ooh.
I know, future, looking to the future forward, hopefully not too far forward that it causes us distress. But like I
Yeah.
even notice, as you may notice as well, certain social media platforms that were more prevalent when we were in our younger years, right, are no longer being used as much. Facebook seems so passe in many ways. Instagram's so prevalent, but TikTok seems even more well used. So, what do you feel like will happen over the years with social media?
Mm. I think this is a fascinating topic. So you're going to get probably more of an answer than you're expecting.
Okay,
But
that's good. Yeah.
a lot of the initial social media, like Facebook, Instagram, I know there were ones before that, but these are the ones that were like within my time.
Yeah.
Um, they're very user oriented. Like, you have your friends and the content you see is what your friends post. YouTube is a slight shift from that, because you have the YouTube algorithm putting like all the suggested videos and everything around, so that you like, they're like, we know kind of what you like and it's there, but like you don't have to watch it. I think a lot of people spend time on YouTube searching for things and then following that rabbit hole, rather than like, I just pull up YouTube and click on what seems interesting for my homepage.
Mm-hmm.
TikTok is fascinating. I I love the TikTok algorithm. Like, I'll be honest, it is my favorite of all the social medias, because it learns it learns you so well as a person that, like, depending on your mood, it will feed you different content.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fascinating, because that's a major change from Facebook, Instagram, where it's like, this is a social thing, it's showing you what the people around you are saying, over to this is an interest thing. The
Mm-hmm.
algorithm is not based on necessarily your connections as much as it's based on what are you interested in. And in general, how all social media platforms tend to work is like, they start out small, they get bigger and bigger, and then as a world run by money like creates, they turn into this thing where it's like, it becomes about ad revenue, and then it becomes less and less personable and like intimate, and more of just kind of like, it's like Instagram right now, where it's like every third thing feels like it's an ad for something.
Mm-hmm.
And as that happens, they get replaced by another platform, and then another platform, and then another platform. And I think that the future of this is going to be moving in the direction of like interest related content, and platforms that, instead of being like, you can exactly pick what you're seeing, which you can kind of do that on any of these platforms if you're willing to work at it.
Mm-hmm.
But the average user, I don't think, does that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we're going to see more and more interest related things, where it's like, you show up in our space and we're going to get to know you, and then we're going to give you what we think you want.
Right.
And because our algorithm is so smart, we'll probably be right. And I think that's the direction, and that's scary if we are not thinking about it, not aware of it. And that's fun if you're aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
Because like, when I use TikTok, I open it, I decide what kind of mood I am. Am I in like laughing mood, mental health mood, like fill in the blank?
Mm-hmm.
And I will spend like the first 2 or 3 minutes just like, if I see something that's not the mood I'm in, I intentionally swipe by it really fast.
Mm-hmm.
And if you try this, it's really interesting, because you can basically, in 2 or 3 minutes, create a For You page that's only showing you like one type of thing. And then occasionally it pops in something else to be like, are you interested? We'll see.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Oh,
that, I think that's fun, because I'm thinking about it. But if I wasn't doing that, if I was just kind of like doom scrolling to wherever I end up, it's scary.
yeah. So basically, you're insinuating that it's like TikTok is really interesting from the algorithm that it's going to actually be able to read your mood in some ways because of how quickly we're viewing something or how long we're staying on a certain type of topic. And there is going to be that progression towards more of that through other social media platforms that may arise over time.
Mhm. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, we really appreciate you joining us today. Was there anything else that you felt was important to share or to mention or to touch on?
Ooh.
I know, big question at the end. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything.
Yeah.
And I want to be mindful of your time as well.
I think that the biggest thing is just that as you are using content, interacting with whatever it is, engaging, be responsible and think about it.
Mhm.
And for parents, like you can't really control what kids are exposed to. You can
Mhm.
try, but like very controlling parents, typically all they end up doing is making it so that they don't know what's going on. Because for the most part, kids will figure out a way. And if they're not allowed to see it, they just won't tell you they are. So don't don't be legalistic. Just be open and focus not on like what you're trying to keep your kid from, but focus on building them up as people, encouraging them, like building their self-worth.
Mhm. I
And
think
then
that's beautiful.
for adolescents, like think about what you're engaging with and take things with a grain of salt. Because the more you move in a direction, the more you'll get drawn in that direction by the algorithm, by just everything.
Mhm.
And you have to be careful because every individual is exactly that. Like they are an individual who has unique gifts, needs, like traits, all the things. And there's no box that perfectly fits you. So
Mhm.
you don't need to look for one. Like just be
Mhm.
you.
Yeah. I think that's a wonderful message. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
Well,
you.
yeah, of course. It was really interesting. I've learned some really great stuff today. I always love chatting to different professionals. I always feel like I get to learn something new. So I feel very privileged to be in the seat.
You're very good at it. You, as I mentioned earlier, like you're good at listening, condensing, and handing back in a way that I think draws out a lot of the main points and in a way that's more digestible.
Thank
So
you. I appreciate that.
yeah.
Because I'm very much in my mind systematic and very cognitive. So I'm very much like 1, 2, 3. And so I try to kind of summarize into those ideas because I don't know, like we can't always take away a whole hour information, but I like what are
Mhm.
some tangible things or points that someone could take away from a podcast episode or information that's useful or helpful for them. So I
Mhm.
appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.